The Quebec Conference, October 10th to 29th, 1864, Chapter 5, The Delegates' Arrival in Quebec City. The Quebec Conference was 3 weeks long and consisted of delegates from Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and the Dominion of Newfoundland. The Newfoundland delegation consisted of only two men, Frederick Barker Tarrington Cody and Ambrose Shea. They had come to Quebec City to see what these Canadians and their fellow Atlantic and Maritime delegates had to say about the Dominion of Newfoundland joining the Pan-Canadian Confederation. The delegation from New Brunswick was Sir Samuel Tilly, Edward Chandler, Charles Fisher, John Hamilton Gray, Peter Mitchell, William Steeves, and John Johnston as well. The Prince of Island delegation consisted of Colonel John Hamilton Gray, George Coles, Andrew Archibald MacDonald, Edward Palmer, William Henry Pope, Thomas Heath Haviland, and Edward Whalen. The Nova Scotia delegation was made of Dr. Charles Tupper, Adams Archibald, Robert B. Dickey, William Henry, and Jonathan Macaulay. The Lower Canadian delegation consisted of George Chen Thomas Dennison McGee, Dr. Etienne Pascal Taché, Alexander Tillage Galt, Jean-Charles Chapelle, and Hector Lee Ganville, as well as of the Quebec City, only 4 were French Canadians. This is because George Chen had decided, either at the Charlottetown Conference or shortly thereafter, that only he would speak for his own people, the French Canadians of Lower Canada. The Upper Canadian delegation was made of John A. Macdonald, George Brown, James Cockburn, Alexander Campbell, William McDougall, and Oliver Mowat. It also consisted of a man named Hewitt Bernard, who was the unofficial reporter at the Quebec Conference. Dr. Etienne Pascal Taché does not normally get mentioned by our historians of Canada, which deal with Confederation. In fact, many historians don't pay him any attention outside the province of Quebec. The reason for that goes rather unnoticed, is that he is obscure outside of his hometown of St. Thomas. Actor and politician Dr. Taché was a journalist and owned the only newspaper in his hometown. But to be fair, Dr. Taché is a mass of contradictions. He is the oldest father of Confederation as he was born in 1795, making him the only father of Confederation to be born in the 18th century. And he actually remembered it too. Sadly, Dr. Taché died in 1865. 2 years before Canada became a country, Dr. Taché supported the idea of Confederation up until the Quebec Conference, but then he got cold feet and backed out of the idea, as though he thought it would basically strip the French Canadians of their nationality, linguistic and cultural, and legal rights which the French Canadians enjoyed in Lower Canada. He then became a politician after the establishment of responsible government in Lower Canada. Although he was sometimes involved in being a physician, politician, and journalist, the only reason why we know exactly what Dr. Taché looked like was because at the Quebec Conference in 1864, he had a photograph taken, which is the only known photograph of himself. Most people at the Quebec Conference were journalists who tended to own large and successful newspapers, of which there were over 300 at the time. Among the journalists who ran the politics were George Brown and Alexander Tillage Galt. Brown was once described as a 6'4" tall wall named George Brown. John A. Macdonald and Brown had been bitter enemies for so long that they had forgotten about why they were fighting each other in the first place. Although Macdonald was not a journalist, his best friend and right-hand man Cartier was, in fact, and he owned all the Montreal newspapers, and indeed also owned pretty much all of the French-speaking newspapers in Lower Canada. The Toronto Globe and his other newspapers were owned by George Brown, who went to extremes to attack Macdonald, as Brown included pretty much all of the English-speaking papers in Upper Canada. Another man with such a controlling impact on the newspapers of Upper Canada was Alexander Tillage Galt. It must have been quite interesting to anybody who was into politics in Upper Canada, or indeed Lower Canada, with the English-speaking minority, who were no doubt all somewhat more amused by the fact that Macdonald and Brown would argue the opposite point of what the other was saying in their respective newspapers until the point of what they were saying had passed entirely, or they were so focused on attacking each other that the point they were making on a particular issue at the time had lost all possible meaning, and it was subject to their personal feud of each other. The only person who seemed somewhat neutral in this newspaper Cold War of sorts between Macdonald and Brown was Galt, a stubborn idealist of a man, if there ever was one. Galt owned all the newspapers in Canada. George Brown did not, but rather than divide these two men, it had made them like and trust each other a lot more than what most people today realize, or even in their own lifetimes. Galt was in favor of Confederation because, like Brown, he feared the American threat to the British colonies. Galt and Brown also felt the French Canadians were a danger to the English way of life. Yet these two men were willing to consent to a united British North America via the idea of Confederation in order to help lessen or indeed eliminate the French Canadian threat to the English-speaking people of North America. The fact that George Brown saw the French as being a millstone around the neck of the English, as did Galt. Where these two men differed sharply was the idea for a pan-Canadian intercontinental transcontinental railway system. Brown said the dispute for the Intercanadian Continental Railway system, where there were entirely different sizes of track gauge, will Galt wanted a transcontinental Pan-Canadian railway system to link the Pacific Ocean on the west coast to the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast. The whole reason why Galt shared Macdonald's idea of a transcontinental railway was principally in order to keep the Canadian Northwest Territories from becoming like the American West at the time. This was already an extremely violent and volatile place to be, especially after the American Civil War, which had just ended some 2.5 years before. The idea of a pan-British North American Confederation hadn't gotten even off the ground until the early 1860s. Both Galt and Brown were equally passionate about one thing. That topic was the issue of slavery. In fact, George Brown founded an anti-slavery society in Canada in the early 1830s, although the practice of slavery had died out in Canada and the rest of the British Empire by 1807, and by 1808 slavery was officially abolished in Britain and the British Empire as a whole. Galt also persisted against slavery, but he didn't go quite as far as Brown did. This is because he had a lot of business interest in the southern U.S., so to alienate the Americans any more than he did was not a very good reason. Another reason why Galt was a little bit more modern when it came to the anti-slavery debate was because he had several Southern Americans for business partners and friends, and he wanted to remain on good terms with them. So for all this, Galt was considered somewhat a bit hypocritical by his contemporaries, for he hated slavery but had to deal with it because of his business deals. The Quebec Conference ended with all the delegates going back to their respective colonies and attempting to sell the idea of Confederation to the people of those colonies. Most of them would have to face an election between the Quebec Conference and the next agreed upon one in London, England, for December 1866.